If you have to take a class in poetic devices and you have to address the misconceptions that students often have about the poetic devices, I think you must first introduce your class by explaining the difference between the poetic language and the prosaic language. It's very important so that students understand how poetry is different from prose and what is the language of poetry. Only then will they be able to appreciate poetic devices in a better way. So you introduce your class by establishing this difference between poetic language and prose language, and you can start it like this. You give a very basic rhyme or basic poem to them. Twinkle twinkle little star, how I wonder what you are. It's a very basic rhyme, but it conveys the sense of wonderment of a child upon beholding the shining stars in the sky in a very beautiful and creative manner. Then you explain to the students in your class the meaning of these lines in uh, simple plain prose language, and you tell them that the child sees the sky and sees the shining stars in the sky and is full of wonder about them, and the child is thinking what those stars are. So this is one way of conveying the same meaning and the same emotion. But the language of poetry, of course, is more captivating. And what makes the language of poetry so forceful, so intense, so captivating is the use of various elements. Elements like rhythm, rhyme, melody, poetic devices. And then you come to the topic of poetic devices. So, through this brief introduction, where you establish the difference between the language of poetry and the language of prose, you come to the elements which make poetry so beautiful. One of them being poetic devices, and then you explain various kinds of poetic devices to the students. There are n number of poetic devices, from simile, metaphor, refrain, anaphora, alliteration, and symbolism, imagery. There are so many of them. You can explain each one of them one by one, and then give examples related to them so that the understanding is cemented. And you can take examples from the poems in the syllabus itself, or you can bring additional resource with you in the class. Use different kinds of poems, famous poems, classical poems, poems that students are familiar with, or unknown poems also that they have never read or heard before. So these are the additional resources you can use in your class, and I think you can make a PowerPoint presentation also while explaining the poetic devices to the students, where you can explain each poetic device with a lot of examples in between. Now, while teaching poetic devices, it is very important to address the misconceptions around them, because this is one topic in poetry where students have a lot of confusion about various poetic devices. Like, for example, students often get confused between simile and metaphor, because both the poetic devices entail comparison between two things, and they get confused where is simile used and where metaphor is being used. They cannot differentiate between the two. So it's very important for you as a teacher to establish the difference between the two kinds of poetic devices, and this understanding of the students about each poetic devices should be very clear. And for this, I think what you can do is that you can make use of the technology. You can make use of slides and show a lot of examples to the students, which is not possible otherwise, because the visual element should also be there, and the understanding becomes clearer if both the auditory and visual functions are being used by the students. They can understand in a better way. So while explaining simile, you can tell them that in both kinds of poetic devices, simile as well as metaphor, there is a comparison between the two things. But in simile, this comparison is not complete, and you must tell students that as the name simile itself suggests, it is related to similarity. It sounds very much like similarity. So similarity means two things are different. Similarity itself says that two things are different, but in some aspects they are similar to each other. They are alike each other in some aspects. but they are not the same. So that is what similarity is, and that is what the poetic device simile is. When two things are being compared, but the comparison is not so complete and is not so direct, uh, then it becomes a simile. And how do we identify simile? Because in simile, the words as and like are being used while comparing the two things with each other. And then you can give examples. You can give example of mm, uh, Shakespeare's famous poem, his famous line, "I wander lonely as a cloud." Here, the poet compares himself with a cloud using the word as. And since the word as has been used, the students can easily identify that this is simile. Then, another example, Robert Burns' famous lines. Um, uh, my love is like a red, red rose. So here love is being compared with rose using the word like. This is another example of simile. Then you explain the poetic device of metaphor to them and tell them that metaphor is a poetic device where the comparison between two things is complete. And it is so complete that one thing is being described completely in terms of another. And then you can give examples from the textbook or from additional poems from classical and very famous poems also, like Shakespeare's a very famous line of Shakespeare from the play As You Like It can be used here, where Shakespeare compares the whole world with a stage. So all the world is a stage. So world is being compared with stage, but the comparison is so complete that world is being called stage itself, and there is no use of the word as or like. So this is example of metaphor. Another is hope is a thing. Uh, hope is the thing with feathers. That is another example of metaphor.